Funding for this program is provided by the National Institute of Justice.
Residential punishment, 19 years, Texas Department of Corrections.
Hello, I'm James Wilson. Violence in this country is frequently a family matter. About 1/4 of all homicides and aggravated assaults are committed by one family member against another, most often during a fight between husband and wife or between lovers. As someone once said, the most dangerous place in America is the bedroom. Until recently, police have been unable or reluctant to make arrests in domestic violence cases. Often the victim will not press charges, making an arrest problematic or a conviction difficult. Moreover, police often feel their major responsibility is to end the quarrel, either by mediating the dispute or by getting the assailant out of the house for a few hours. For many years, psychologists agreed with them, urging police to refer violent spouses to a social work agency for counseling. Until 1984, nobody knew which method for handling domestic assaults, arrest or counseling, worked best.
Police and fire emergency?
Yes.
This is the police.
Yes.
Do you want the police?
Yes. They're on the line. Pardon?
What do you want?
Okay, what I want is a battered woman.
You are a battered woman?
Yes.
Who assaulted you?
My ex, not my ex, but it's my fiance.
All right. Did he have any weapons, or did he just use his
No,
hands?
just use his fist.
All right. He does not have any weapons.
No.
Are there any in the house?
He's in the house and I'm scared.
Is he in the house?
Yes, and I'm scared.
In most domestic assault cases, the man is the assailant. Over time, the abuse usually increases in both frequency and severity. Domestics, or police calls to homes with family violence, are among the most common calls officers receive.
Generally, emotions, as they said, are high. You have to just common practice, try to separate the people, take some control of the situation, let them know that, nothing's going to get resolved unless we can quiet things down to where we can hear what the problem is and ask some intelligent questions and get some intelligent answers, which doesn't happen when people are ignoring you and screaming at one another.
In the past, Minneapolis police were told to mediate domestic violence, give advice, or send the man out of the house to cool off.
We thought we were pretty good at giving advice and sending people away and, giving all sorts of storefront advice. You know what our main concern here is? That this argument doesn't get out of hand, somebody gets physically hurt.
Officer Hestness participated in a Police Foundation experiment in Minneapolis to discover which method of policing worked best in domestic violence cases. When police arrived at the scene of a domestic fight, they pulled a top sheet of paper from an envelope. That piece of paper, which had been randomly marked, instructed the officer to act in one of three ways: try to mediate the dispute, send the assailant out of the house for a while, or arrest the assailant. Cases were followed for 6 months. The findings were striking. Assailants were only half as likely to repeat the violence if arrested than if police used mediation or sent the abuser away.
The Police Foundation study about what might be the most effective response was a huge motivator to the police department to change their policy about how they would deal with domestics.
The Minneapolis Police Department has changed its policy in domestic violence calls. Now an arrest is expected if there are any visible signs of injury, a dangerous weapon is involved, or the officer believes the violence will continue. An arrest is possible even if no injuries are visible, as long as the victim claims to be in fear of immediate bodily harm. An officer is required to state in writing why he did not make an arrest if he was legally able to do so. The number of arrests has risen dramatically. Welcome news for the women's advocacy groups that lobbied for the change.
It's a positive step that may be difficult to implement because you're going up against traditional ways of police officers handling domestics, which is to leave it in the family, that this is not a police matter, that you should take care of it. So consequently, it's difficult to get them to utilize their powers of arrest.
Some police officers are not happy with the new arrest policy. They say they need more flexibility in handling domestic situations, which are often complicated and confusing.
There's certain circumstances, I guess, where police officers like to be able to use their discretion depending on the circumstances that we see. It always looks a lot different to when you're down before a judge presenting a case than it is when you actually are out there firsthand observing the attitudes of both parties that may be involved in a domestic assault.
We deal with so many people, so many domestics, especially in the lower area of the precinct here, that they don't care whether you arrest anybody or not, the victims and the assailants or anybody. All they want is somebody to do something about the problem at the moment, and they'll be right back to the same problem tomorrow.
To the man, then, it's saying, don't do this again, or you'll go to jail. To the woman, it says, if he does this again, you have someone to turn to. So I think that's why an arrest can make a difference.
Here to discuss the implications of this experiment and what lessons, if any, it has for other police departments are Lawrence Sherman, Vice President of the Police Foundation, George Napper, Commissioner of Police in Atlanta, Georgia, and Barbara Hart of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Larry Sherman, the study for which you were partially responsible seems to suggest that arrest is an important deterrent to spouse assault. But let me press you on this for a moment. How can we be sure that arrest really prevented assaults? Might it also be the case that the wife of a man who was arrested when she called the police first was reluctant to call the police a second time or reluctant to talk to an interviewer, fearing intimidation, and this might make it appear that arrests were working?
We measured the repeat violence after the experimental intervention a couple different ways. We did interview the victims every 2 weeks for a 6-month follow-up period, or at least those who would cooperate, but we also tracked subsequent arrests so that even if the victims were reluctant to tell us about repeat violence, if the neighbors called the police, which they did half the time of any of the calls we got, and the police came back again, then that was recorded as a subsequent violence incident. So even if the woman felt intimidated, we were able to find out whether repeat violence occurred.
So you're satisfied that arrest was making a difference in comparison to other ways of treating things?
In Minneapolis, at that period of time with those kinds of people, yes.
Now, why is it that arrest would make a difference? As I understand it, the arrested man typically spent virtually no time in jail, often was back out in hours or a day. What happened, do you think?
Well, actually, the man did spend at least one night in jail, sometimes more than that, like the whole weekend, waiting for a judge. And that's different from the way it is in other cities. And one of the questions about the application in other cities is whether if you get booked and an hour later you're back in the house, it's going to have the same deterrent effect as it does in Minneapolis, where they did have jail. What didn't happen was that they didn't go to prison. Only 2% of those who were arrested had any sanction imposed by a judge at all. The rest of the cases, the charges were dropped or there was a diversion. So it's not a question of having to see a judge do something about it. That's often the excuse police give for not making arrests. From what we can tell, it doesn't make any difference as long as perhaps he gets the taste of jail overnight immediately after the domestic call occurs.
Now, in the case where the man was arrested, did the woman frequently sign a complaint or make a complaint? On what grounds was the person arrested?
The whole point of the 1978 reform of the law in Minnesota, which has now occurred in 28 states totally, was to give the police the power to sign the complaint, regardless of the victim's preferences. Some of these arrests were made over the protests of the victim who did not want the arrest to occur. And the principle that the legislature has endorsed is that this is a crime against the state. And this person may commit violence again. It's in the state interest for the police to lock them up on their own authority, and that's what they did.
What impact has this study had on police practices in other places?
A number of cities, New York, Houston, Dallas, Phoenix, Tucson, constituting over 10% of all the police officers in the country, have told us they changed their policy to encourage arrest as a result of the Minneapolis study. The vast majority of the big city departments, however, are still not making arrests, still either encouraging mediation, as Chicago and a lot of other places are, or just not giving any guidance to their police whatsoever.
Now, is it a good idea for so many police departments to change their policies on the basis of one experiment?
That's a tough question because the question is in comparison to what? We've had police training programs for the last 15 years on how to deal with domestic violence on the basis of no research. Just a few people's opinions that maybe counseling was a good idea or sending people away for the night. I can see reasons why it might not apply in other cities, why in fact arrest might even backfire. But I have to say my own best judgment is that given the limited evidence, yes, we can make this policy recommendation, although we've got to replicate the study, and we're negotiating the possibility of repeating it in 11 other cities. And we may say that after that arrest is not the best idea in all cities. But in the meantime, I think the recommendation has to be to encourage more arrests than are being made now.
Well, let's look at one particular city, in this case Atlanta, Georgia. George Napper, you are the police commissioner there. You've been in the police department for many years. What is the Atlanta policy for handling domestic violence?
Well, our policy with respect to felony situations is to make arrests. With respect to simple assaults and misdemeanors, we have a strong domestic crisis intervention team, and we are involved in treatment as a way of dealing with that.
Before you describe the treatment, clarify for the audience the difference between a felony and a misdemeanor assault.
Well, legally, a felony is one for which a person can go to prison for a year or more, and a misdemeanor is one of lesser a period of time.
In the typical case, a felony assault might be one where there was a weapon used or a serious physical harm inflicted.
That's true.
And a simple assault was one in which there wasn't serious physical harm.
That's correct.
Okay. And now, how does the Domestic Crisis Intervention Unit work?
Well, all of our police officers receive training in how to intervene in a domestic situation in a recruit training program. Some 40 hours of training in that setting. And subsequent to that, they have 80 hours of advanced training. And they couple their activities with the Children's Service and Family Counseling Center in the city of Atlanta, so that there is a social worker who is coupled with a police officer who respond to these kinds of situations. We make sure that our social workers are involved in the referral kinds of activities to make sure that these people get the kind of treatment and follow-up that they need.
Now, you, by following this policy, clearly have not been persuaded that arrest is the right policy in all cases of simple assault. What is it that you find unpersuasive about the Minneapolis experiment and the conclusions that have been drawn from it?
Well, I think you touched upon one of them with respect to the fact that everybody thinks that arrest, by virtue of the Minneapolis study, is the best way to deal with a domestic situation. And I have some concerns as to whether the lower number of reported violence is an artifact of reporting or is in fact because of the arrest feature itself. And until we can get further information about that, I have some reluctance to accept that. The other thing that is commonly accepted about the Minneapolis study is that treatment does not work. Now, I think it's very clear to anyone who would look very closely at that study that that category was an ill-defined category. So what we have is arrest, which is standardized and very distinct, and we have the treatment category, where you have a whole spectrum of activities that would range from don't do that, or if I come back, I'll put you in jail, to, in fact, I'm sure some officers sitting down and actually counseling people and referring them to the appropriate social service agencies. So those are not comparable situations. And the other category was to send the subject away. And so, in fact, we have one category that is well-defined and standardized and people understand it. We have the treatment category, which is very ill-defined, and there was no indication at all that officers had any kind of training with respect to treatment. Then we have the third category. And it seems to me that based on that, the best we can say is that arrest is better than nothing, because the treatment modality has not got a fair hearing with respect to the Minneapolis study.
Have you done any research, or do you know the research done by others that does provide us with evidence as to the consequences of treatment, such as your Domestic Crisis Intervention Unit?
Well, I think there's some things that are suggestive, especially in our city of Atlanta. Looking at our stats from January of '83 to October of 1984, we had 6,000 referrals from police and from the courts. And in those cases, we only had 4 homicides. That is very suggestive, and it speaks to the need for us to do much more of this. But more than that, there's also the concern that I have about the study. The study, as I read it, focused on simple assaults. And my concern is that police departments are now changing policies based on that, that may have some impact on felonious assaults. And I'm not sure that you can extrapolate data from simple assaults and generalize that to the felony situations that police officers find themselves involved in.
Thank you. Barbara Hart, you've heard the positions of Larry Sherman and George Napper. They differ a bit on what strategy might best be supported by the research. Which strategy do you recommend police departments follow in handling domestic violence cases?
We strongly encourage arrest. This is not to say that we are opposed to treatment, but we are opposed to treatment by police officers. I think the distinction was not made between what treatment is effective, who would do effective treatment. We think that treatment, if that is appropriate for men who batter, is a long-term process. 6 months to a year is essential for the kind of change to occur that we believe will terminate violent behaviors. Part of the difficulty in this situation is that assault on wives do not occur once. They occur over and over again. They get more serious. Sometimes they get more frequent. We know that we're talking about a pattern here. You don't interrupt a pattern that may have been in existence for several years by one police therapeutic intervention. We believe that therapy needs to happen elsewhere and that arrest has a very profound effect on batterers, especially those who have no prior criminal record. So as to that, I would agree that we need to look at the difference between felony and simple assault arrests, because often the simple assault arrestee, if I may, is someone who does not have a prior criminal record. And somebody who does not have a prior criminal record may be much more deterred by being taken to the police department, especially in the Minneapolis situation where he's detained for 6 hours, 12 hours, in an entire weekend. There's real notice to him that somebody is taking this seriously and that his freedom will be limited if he continues to violate the person that is the complainant.
We've been using the word he, and of course that is, I think, statistically accurate. Most assaulters, most murderers are in fact male, but there are women who assault husbands or who kill husbands. Do you recommend in the case of simple assault where the woman seems to be the assailant that an arrest also should be used?
I think that the police officer needs to do some investigation. If after investigation he determines that the woman who assaulted acted in self-defense, then I think that an arrest should not occur. However, if the police officer determines that the woman initiated the assault and it was not in self-defense, yes, I think she should be arrested.
Now, what legal powers do the police need in order to make an arrest or not make an arrest? We've talked about felonious and assault and simple assault. If the state statute authorizes the police to make an arrest for an assault, under what circumstances ordinarily can they make it when it's a felonious, that is to say, a serious assault, and under what circumstances usually can they make it when it's a simple or misdemeanor assault?
When it's a simple assault or misdemeanor assault, the police officer may arrest, for example, in Pennsylvania, if he or she sees the assault occurring. However, may not arrest unless he or she sees it occurring. If the assault occurs outside of the officer's presence, they may not arrest. In a felony situation, whether they see it or they don't see it, but they have reason to believe, the standard is a probable cause standard. In that officer's best judgment, taking into consideration all of the circumstances, is a reason to believe that the assault alleged, the felonious assault alleged, has occurred. If the officer determines that to be the case, the officer may arrest, even though it did not occur in his or her presence.
Larry, you've looked at the national statistics. How many states roughly allow the police to insist that the police follow this traditional distinction? You can make an arrest for felonious assault if you have probable cause. You can make an arrest for assault, for simple assault, only if it was committed in your presence. How many states maintain that distinction? How many states have changed?
28 states have changed, but 22 states still handcuff the police for making arrests in the most common form of assaults, which is the misdemeanor assault, unless they see it. Now, the state of Maryland is so bad that even if the woman is willing to sign a complaint and make it a citizen's arrest, which is possible in a lot of states, the state of Maryland won't allow the police to make an arrest then. You have to take the victim to a magistrate, get a warrant signed, come back to the house where, of course, the assailant is patiently waiting with his hands stretched out, waiting to be handcuffed.
I see. But many states have passed laws, 22 I think you said, or perhaps half of the states, that would allow the police to make an arrest when there's a simple assault using the probable cause standard. Is that correct?
They've passed those laws. As far as I can tell, they're not being used. Virginia just changed the law a year ago, for example, and the police in the Bay area have all said that they're not using the laws. They think the laws are silly and they don't want to make arrests.
Now, George Napper has expressed his reservations and his preferences for treatment. Why generally do you think the police are reluctant to use the legal power when they have it to make an arrest in a domestic violence case?
For one reason, there's this myth that domestic violence is a very dangerous call for the police to get involved in, and they want to keep their risks low and get out of it right away. In fact, it is a myth. We've looked at police officers killed in New York City and other places, and it's not 20 or 30% of those killings in domestic situations. It's more like 2%. As far as we can tell, domestic violence calls are probably safer than traffic stops. But I think the police may also be reluctant to get involved because they get frustrated when the victim does not follow through by going to court and having the full burdens of the criminal justice system imposed on the offender. But as far as we can tell in Minneapolis, that's not necessary to reduce the violence.
What does the law call for in your state? Does it enable the police to make an arrest in simple assault cases on probable cause, or do they have to have a victim complaint or see it occur in their presence?
No, it's the former.
It is.
But I think we need to be clear on one point with respect to what I'm saying. I've stated a preference for treatment with respect to the simple assaults. Mm-hmm. Now, with respect to felonies, we don't have a lot of flexibility on that point. We do make arrests.
Right. Now, you've heard two persons suggest that arrest may be the best way for interrupting a career that, beginning with a simple assault, could lead on to more serious assaults. You're expressing a preference for a therapy, counseling, treatment as a way of interrupting that career. Do you see a way whereby arrest and treatment could be combined in some more general package?
Well, I do, and that's something that we're trying to do in the city of Atlanta. And I'm not sure to what extent it was done even in the arrest situations in Minneapolis. That is, what is the role, for example, of other agencies in the post-intervention situation? When arrests were made, for example, I'd like to know in Minneapolis, did the court in some cases order people for treatment or counseling, and that in fact had some impact on the number of repeat calls.
Larry, did that happen?
Well, there was a diversion program for victims who signed the complaint. The offender would be diverted to some kind of treatment, but the reports we get back is that they don't show up to the treatment, and the court doesn't hold them back in if they fail to show up. In effect, the treatment program gets ignored. I have to compliment Atlanta for devoting so much energy and resources to developing a special domestic intervention unit, and have to say that most police departments haven't done that. And it may well be that a specially trained police unit intervening in domestic violence cases might be able to do on-the-scene mediation. I tend to agree with Barbara Hart that it's a serious problem that requires long-term intervention, but it's possible the kinds of things that they do in Atlanta have as good an effect as an immediate arrest. We just don't know. My problem is most departments aren't going to have those skills. They're not going to put those kinds of resources in.
Most departments aren't going to do either, if what I understand you're saying
Indeed.
is correct. They're not going to make
right.
the arrest, and they're not going to mount the major effort that Atlanta has made to have an intervention unit.
No, most of them would do what our undefined category in the study was, which is to go in, talk to people, tell them to shut up and leave.
Barbara, do you see a way of combining arrest with your concern for long-term treatment?
Absolutely.
How would this work?
Well, in the Duluth Project, for example, in Minnesota, another part of Minnesota that Larry may go to later, I hope, they have mandatory arrest in domestic situations. The police officer takes the assailant to the police station. He is immediately brought before the judge. Shortly thereafter, he is either sentenced or pleads guilty. He usually pleads guilty. Part of pleading guilty in those misdemeanor situations in Duluth puts him in a 6-month treatment program.
Now, what is the nature of this treatment program? What is the essential form of therapy?
The first, I believe, 12 weeks of that treatment program is group counseling with other men who have assaulted with trained mental health facilitators. The second portion of that 6-month period is educational meetings with men who have participated in the treatment to further sharpen their cognitive skills to help them deal with the violence and to avoid it. In fact, in Duluth, we understand that most of those men who are in treatment are still living with the women who they had battered. And it seems the arrest, the immediate plea and or sentencing, the counseling, plus monitoring of the counseling to make sure if they don't show up, they get taken back into court, and they do anywhere from 10 to 30 days for not appearing in counseling. That seems to have had a deterrent effect as well. And that many women who live in Duluth have told us that, in fact, moving to other small towns where they don't have that kind of very forceful intervention, coordinated system has resulted in their being battered because the assailant knows that no one's going to pay any attention to his behavior and he can get away with it.
Now, do we have any reason to know whether this strategy will have a payoff, a desirable payoff? Do we know what works with respect to treatment?
We don't have any data other than on the Duluth project, which does show us that a year later, about 80% of the men who were arrested have not reoffended.
I see.
And so from my perspective, that means something. That we have not done careful comparative studies of Duluth versus Atlanta or any other cities in terms of looking at recurrence.
Do you think this long-term treatment that follows the arrest and perhaps is a condition of probation is more likely to be successful than a police unit that is specialized to deliver some counseling or mediation service at the scene? Is
Yes.
that what you're suggesting?
That's what I'm suggesting. As long as the police arrest. Because if the police don't arrest, men do not voluntarily participate in counseling. We have known that.
Your program that involves police intervention, does it lead to any longer-term exposure to services, or is the police service the only service that's being delivered?
No, the police primarily act as a referral agent. In some cases, those who have the training do some mediation and counseling. But they are teamed with social workers who are trained to deliver those kinds of services and to make sure that the people get to the appropriate agencies. So there's a whole network of agencies that are involved in helping us to deal with this problem. It's not a service that is delivered primarily by the police. I would agree with her that police aren't really trained to do that kind of counseling.
Does a judge play any role in ensuring that a man sent into a treatment program will stay in the program during the full length of the program?
That is something that is increasing in the city of Atlanta. And as I indicated earlier, some of the referrals that we have come from the courts as well. So the arrests are made in many situations, and the judge will order that person to treatment and hold incarceration over his head as a leverage to make sure that he gets it.
Thank you very much, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. For Crime File, I'm James Wilson.
Funding for this program was provided by the National Institute of Justice. This program was produced by the Police Foundation, which is solely responsible for its content.